The document that you completed for homework helps us to dismantle some of the very popular myths about gladiator fighting and possibly make some comparisons to more modern um, understandings of both Roman culture and our own. So we're going to start out with the Oath of the Gladiators, which is Uri, Vincere, Verberari, Feroque Necare. The translation of this is to be burned, to be shackled, to be beaten, to be killed by the sword. These words signify a gladiator's willingness to do whatever it takes to entertain the crowd and to be of service to his government by participating in these gladiator fights. There are some certain grammatical concepts that we have talked about this year that we see in the Sacramentum. Do you know what they are? You're correct. They are present passive infinitives. That "ri" at the end is going to be our cue that it's a passive infinitive. It gets translated to be blanked. And then we have "fero," which is the ablative of means that we see with a passive verb. The very first gladiatorial games were offered at a funeral in the year 264 BC. The Latin word for the games is munus munera, which is offering or a gift for a funeral. This sort of builds from the tradition in Bronze Age warfare, in which when a very significant warrior died on one side or the other, frequently you would honor the victim by having a series of athletic contests or funeral games. You've probably seen examples of this in the Odyssey, and you've definitely seen examples of this in the Iliad, in that a fallen comrade would be honored with a series of things like chariot races or archery contests or something like that. So the athletic contests were put on as a gift to honor the courage of the one that had fallen by proving your own courage against theirs. In a way, we have some modern athletic contests that are similar to gladiator fighting. However, they are not used for funeral offerings, or they're not used to honor the dead. After a certain time, the munera, or the funeral games, if you will, started to become performed in more open spaces. The first place was the Forum Boarum, which is literally the cattle marketplace, or the Campus Martius, which is also where the Roman army trained. Campus is field, and Martius means it's dedicated to Mars, the god of war. At a certain point, a marvel of modern architecture was built, and you know it as the Colosseum. It's also called the Flavian Amphitheater. It was called the Colosseum because it featured a really ginormous statue of the Emperor Nero. There's a little bit of sordid history here, though, because the Emperor Nero was emperor in the year 64, which was during a very significant fire in Rome. In the year 64 CE, I would think it's about 80% of Rome burned to the ground while Nero was the emperor. A lot of people think that he had something to do with it. The old adage is that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. That's probably not true. We're not 100% sure what he was doing during the fire. We do know that he was a very young ruler. We do know that he didn't have a lot of good ruling capability. So it's very possible that when a devastating fire came to his city, that he really didn't know how to handle it. So maybe his coping mechanisms weren't the best, but he probably wasn't actually playing the lyre. It does stand to reason, though, that Nero was very involved in the dramatic arts. He really liked acting and singing and playing instruments and things like that. And those are all wonderful callings for people in life. However, you can pretty much safely assume that Roman government officials did not think that an emperor should be, participating in such affairs when he was really supposed to be, the ruler of really their entire world. So Nero really gets a bad rap, but I think a lot of his actions need to be seen through this lens that no one really liked him anyway. So no matter what he was doing during the fire, it was going to be called into, or it was going to be viewed under a great deal of scrutiny. So Nero had the fire happen while he was emperor, and then after Nero was assassinated, Rome decided to rebuild and to make progress in their world beyond Nero and his sort of curse, if you will, on Rome. And so the Emperor Titus built in 80 CE, well, I mean, he finished it in 80 CE, the Flavian Amphitheater, which would hold lots of gladiatorial contests in its inaugural year. Now, something you should know about Emperor Titus, although he gets the credit for opening the Flavian Amphitheater, he's actually not a great guy in terms of world history. The Emperor Titus was responsible for a really devastating campaign against the Jews in Jerusalem, and he really decimated the population in a very unceremonious way. It's really, in my opinion, it's a blemish on Rome's civilization for sure. But the Romans did not think so, and the Romans actually ended up building him a triumphal arch in the Forum to celebrate his victory. Um, so the Emperor Titus did build the Colosseum, so we do like him for that at least. And the floor of the amphitheater of the Colosseum was covered with something called harena, and harena is the Latin word for sand. In Latin, typically when a vowel is at the beginning, well, when an H is at the beginning of a word and is followed by a vowel, you actually don't pronounce the H. So the pronunciation would be arena, which gives us, I think, more smoothly the English word arena. So a lot of people think that gladiators fought to the death. And they did at first. The word gladiator comes from gladius, which means sword. And at first, the slaves were fighting to the death to honor their master. Um, but then, of course, slaves came from other places beyond just Rome, and that's when it became sort of the mythology, at least, that slaves were being sacrificed for some other purpose. Um, Spartacus, who was a very famous gladiator, he was one who led the slave revolt in Rome. He came from a place called Thrace, which is in Greece. The Thracian gladiators were actually very widely known for being very fierce and very tough, and almost to the point of being invincible. Although obviously they were still human. Um, Somebody who volunteered for the position was called infamus. Infamus means disreputable, without reputation. So fama is the word for reputation. So if you were disreputable, you were infamous. You were without a reputation. It was considered, disgraceful to volunteer yourself for the sake of entertainment and to possibly lose your life, really just for the sake of, making people smile or laugh or anything like that. So it's, sort of an interesting take on it, because I think that in later times the gladiators came to be seen as very noble athletes, but in the beginning it was considered not such a good thing to, to volunteer for this position. As you saw, there are records for female gladiators, but of course they were few and very far between. And then, of course, they were banned in the year 200 by the emperor whose name was Septimius Severus. After a certain point, when gladiator games were becoming more popular and more widely spread throughout the empire, it people started to realize that, to be fair, you could kind of make a profit off of this. So people started owning gladiators. Julius Caesar owned gladiator. Atticus, who was the famous correspondent with Cicero, he also owned gladiators as well. This is one of the most interesting parallels to modern society. In this paragraph, it starts out that it's akin to owning a racehorse, and indeed, in America, at least in 2017, the racehorse industry is quite prolific, and it's quite a lucrative industry. So in a way, you have people who are investing in horses, but in Rome, you have people who are investing in humans. And this, of course, brings me to one of my favorite points about gladiator fighting, and one of the reasons that I appreciate it as a sport so much, and that is that I am actually a really big fan personally of mixed martial arts. I follow the UFC. I've been watching MMA competitions for I want to say about 12, 13 years or so now. And I always really enjoy the idea of a lot of coaches putting in this investment of time and character development into the fighters that we all get to see on TV. I do like the sort of perennial training aspect of it. I like the athletic contests. I mean, I know that this might seem like a bit of a surprise to you, but I'm actually a really big fan of it, and not just because it does resemble, a modern form of gladiator fighting. But in 2017, when you do have, human coaches investing in these human fighters' lives, and when you have, this sort of human capital, if you will. It's interesting to see how the sport has evolved over the years to accommodate for the fact that these are human beings and they are not out there solely for our entertainment, that you have to make the fight safe for them. For example, when a fighter has been knocked unconscious, the ref calls the fight at that point, because if you receive blows and you can't defend yourself properly and you can't recover from it mentally, you can actually get your potential for brain damage beyond that point in time is actually pretty significant. So you do have to kind of keep it in check so the ref can call the fight. So I appreciate the sort of protective nature of some of the rules of fighting. There are different weight classes so that you don't get involved in a fight that you're not really qualified to fight in, etc. Um, so, I just think that that's a really interesting parallel to where we are today in terms of, having standards for our fighters based on our desire to keep them fighting. I think a lot of people assumed that, gladiators always fought to the death. But if you think about it, it's actually a silly policy, maybe even stupid, to have gladiators fight for the death. Because if you are owning them and you're paying for them to be trained, and if you're paying for someone to feed them, etc., you don't want them to die. You want them to continue fighting for you. And if they're a really good fighter, then they're bringing in a lot of money in the fighting arena. So if they are continuously a source of lucrative income for you, you don't want them to just get taken out in a random fight. So I think that that's an interesting factual basis that kind of challenges a lot of the mythology that people have. And I think a lot of people imagine that the Romans were much more bloodthirsty than they really were, because they think that gladiators always fought to the death. So, maybe you can pass along this little nugget of wisdom to people that you encounter. Um, so there was a trainer at these gladiator schools. It was called a lanista. In the very famous Gladiator movie with Russell Crowe, the lanista, or the trainer, his name was Proximo. So if you remember anything about the movie, or if you want to Google his character, you're looking for Proximo. The name of the person who sponsored the games was called the editor. And in the Republic, the editor was held by the ideal. And in the Empire, the emperor held most of the Republic positions unto himself, except for the position of Senate. So during the Empire, the emperor was the editor, or sort of the sponsor of the games. It makes sense that the state really had to kind of streamline or make universal some of the standards for gladiatorial training, and so that's where the state comes into play. So the oath that, or the alleged saying that the gladiators spoke before their fight was "Nos morituri te salutamus." We who are about to die salute you. Now, we don't necessarily have consistent proof of this being used in every single gladiatorial combat fight. The one time we do have it was when the Colosseum was flooded on purpose. They reenacted a naval battle. Allegedly, it was the naval battle from the Punic War, for this Naumachia, which is the name that's there. Um, it's pretty impressive that they built the Colosseum in such a way that you could flood the floor and you could have this naval battle. I mean, imagine building the ships. Like, how did you logistically figure out all this stuff? It's really, it really blows your mind when you think about what the Romans were capable of doing and how high their imaginations went and how they really, had such a brilliant mind for stuff like this. Um, so when a gladiator went down and he was in need of some assistance, the crowd would often cheer "Hoc habet" or just "Hobbit," and that would mean he's had it. In other words, like give it a rest, move on to another fight. There is a certain grammatical tool that is used in the phrase "nos morituri te salutamus." Do you remember what it is? Morituri is a future active participle. And just to clarify, for conversation's sake, te is the accusative pronoun that has the nominative form of to. Okay, so how did the gladiators die then, right? Because they didn't always die of natural causes. Sometimes they were put to death, sometimes their life was spared. We have these two separate Latin phrases that are used in literature that tell us what the emperor did in order to either spare a life or keep a life. Now, I've given you the gifs, if you will, from the Gladiator movie. But Pollicem vertere literally means to turn the thumb. That's it. Not to turn it up, not to turn it down, not to turn it to the side, not anything, just to turn. The other term is Pollicem premere, which means to press the thumb. Now, if you put your thumb in a thumbs down position, it does kind of look like you're pressing the thumb down, but if you put your thumb up and you put it up towards, say, your cheek or something, you could press something with your thumb in the upwards direction. So, in other words, we sort of view gladiator fighting through the lens of our American culture. And in American culture, thumbs up is a good sign and thumbs down is a bad sign. So if we were at the end of a gladiator match and we felt like we Americans in 2017 would have to make a call to kill or to spare, we would give a thumbs up to spare someone or a thumbs down to not spare someone. But there's no specific evidence in Roman literature that suggests that thumbs up was Pollicem vertere or thumbs down was Pollicem premere. So, another bastion of mythology that exists and, has permeated through the ages. So, if a gladiator was presumed dead, a man dressed as Charon would enter. Now, Charon, as you might remember from your mythology, he was the ferryman in the underworld. He would take the dead from the border of the underworld across the river Styx and bring them into the underworld. So I gave you this interesting Grim Reaper image because the Grim Reaper and Charon kind of have the same idea, at least in this context, from gladiator fighting. So this Charon-looking guy would enter the arena. He'd prod the gladiator, if you will, with a hot poker. And when we say poker, we're talking about, in the fireplace. If you have a fireplace in your house and you have fireplace tools, you might know that the poker is sort of that, it's a long, metal object and it's got a curve at the end. So he would prod him to make sure that he was truly dead and not faking it. The dead were carried out through a gate called the Porta Libitinensis if the gladiator had died, and the Porta Viviana if he were alive. So, that also marked it for the crowd. I mean, you have to imagine that in the Colosseum, there were so many people. It had the capacity to seat thousands upon thousands of people. So you might not always be able to tell if the gladiator was actually truly dead. So depending on what gate they went out, that would tell you, if that gladiator were alive when he was leaving or dead. So Romans kept careful lists about who was winning and who was losing in these gladiatorial combats. So V stands for vicit, he conquered. P stands for periit, he died. M stands for missus, which means he was sent away. He was alive, but he was sent out. So vicit is the perfect tense from vinco vincere. Periit is from per and ire. Ire, as you remember, is the irregular verb to go. Per is through. So per ire is to go through, basically to go through life and to pass on to death. M stands for missus. Missus is the fourth principal part from mitto mittere, which means it's a fourth principal part, perfect passive participle. So I gave you a couple of images here. One of them is a pretty simple engraving from Rome, but just so you can kind of remember, what it looked like when the Romans were engraving things and keeping lists. And then on the right, I gave you an image of what's called a booking slip. And a booking slip in 2017 is how people bet on sports. So there's sort of an over-under, there are favorites, etc., and the favorites usually take into account the records that the existing athletic contest has, etc. So honest to goodness, I know nothing about sports betting. I know nothing about any kind of betting because I've never done it in my whole life. But we get that concept from the Romans, who kind of followed these gladiator fights and, definitely used it for sports betting purposes. So we have this idea of keeping up records, if you will, of all the fighters from them. If a gladiator fought really well over a long period of time, he might just earn his freedom. And his freedom was given to him with the gift of something called a rudis. And a rudis was a wooden sword that he would be given, and that unto itself symbolized his freedom. After he was free, he was welcome to continue fighting, but he was also welcome to just sort of, retire and, have a family or whatever it was that he wanted to do. So there were three primary classes of gladiators who were fighting. One of them was the Samnites, and the Samnites were known for their scutum, which is their shield, and their galea, which is their helmet. The Esidarius fighters were chariot racers. The Esidarius fighters were sort of a unique breed of fighter because they fought from the position of their horses. You saw this very clearly in the movie Gladiator. When we talked about Caesar and how he conquered Gaul, and it took him 9 years, in which part of 1 year was spent going to Britain. And one of the reasons that Caesar and his men lost so significantly to the British fighters was because the British fighters appeared on the beach with their Esidarius fighters. And the Romans had never seen before chariot racing gladiator fighting types in a war setting, and that really unnerved them because in the Roman perspective, an Esidarius was a very talented and very skilled chariot racer, whereas in war you're not used to seeing such, I guess, extensively experienced soldiers fighting you. And so the Romans were very impressed with the chariot fighting of the Esidarii that they encountered in Britain, but they were also scared off and ran back to mainland Europe with their tail between their legs. And finally, the other class of gladiator was called a retiarius, and the retiarius was called that because he used a net, which is retiarium. So he would fight his opponent and try to catch him in the net, and then once he caught him in a net, almost like a fisherman, he would use his trident to stop his opponent in his place. So it was a very fisherman oriented style of gladiator fighting. And then we get to the Emperor Commodus, and he's pictured on the right here. He's pictured in the middle of a gladiator fight because Commodus, like other emperors who had little side things that they liked to do instead of being emperor, Commodus really liked gladiator fighting. And so he enrolled himself in many, many gladiator fights. Some people think that he fought as many as 1,000 times. You can imagine then that the pressure of his opponent must be significant, because as his opponent, Gladiator, you want to be able to show your skills and you want to be able to show how fierce you are as a fighter, but you don't want to kill the emperor and you don't want to injure him to the point that he might die. But on the flip side, you also have to be able to defend yourself against an emperor who, let's be honest, Commodus was really quite crazy. And in fact, he actually renamed Rome while he was emperor to become Commodian Rome because he loved it so much. He renamed the army the Commodian Army because he loved that so much. But anyway, with an emperor like Commodus, you also had to sort of sponsor a win on his part, but you also didn't want to die at his hands. So there were a lot of things going on that really make Commodus's fighting in the arena a very peculiar thing, and yet he did it 1,000 times. That's a lot of fights to have under sort of oddly auspicious circumstances. As you saw in your notes, he was so crazy that he had to be assassinated, and he ended up being assassinated by someone who should have been sort of his confidant and someone that he was very close to, and he was killed by somebody named Narcissus, who was an athlete that he worked out with, if you will, at the gym. He was his wrestling partner. He helped to kind of train him. So Commodus really wasn't expecting it, but that was kind of the point, because Commodus was basically impenetrable. Lots of people tried to have him assassinated in a variety of different ways, and they were unsuccessful. So the only way to get him to do it was through Narcissus. So that brings us to the end of our Gladiator worksheet. And I hope that this has been a helpful experience and an informative one for you. And now you can start combating all those myths with some factual information about Roman gladiators.